Hello, my name is Chris Ash, and I am the Survivor Leadership Program Manager at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, where I manage the National Survivor Network. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what is gender-based violence, really, and how does patriarchy impact all people's experiences of gender-based violence. We're having this conversation because a lot of times when we say gender-based violence, people assume we only mean violence against women and girls. And that leads a lot of people to feeling excluded. And sometimes they don't understand that the framework for rape, anti-rape activism, anti-sexual violence activism, that framework actually holds true whether we're talking about violence against men, violence against women, violence against people who don't hold either of those identities. So this training is to help you wrap your mind around some of the ways that gender-based violence impacts us all in many of the same ways, right? We know there are some differences, but a lot of things are more alike than not. Just to be clear, since we're talking about trafficking today, so not all human trafficking is gender-based violence, but all sex trafficking is gender-based violence, no matter who it's perpetrated by or against. And gender-based violence is regularly part of the force and coercion in trafficking that occurs outside of commercial sex. So typically when I say gender-based violence, I'm largely referring to sexual abuse, sexual assault and rape, intimate partner violence. These are all things that I think of when I think of gender-based violence. So if you think about gender-based violence, again, as we mentioned earlier, just what comes up for you? As we mentioned in our conversations when we opened, a lot of times when people think of that, they're thinking of violence against women, violence by men against women. But I want to encourage you to think a little more broadly than that. So the definitions that I found that I actually really appreciated, one came from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and that is sexual and gender-based violence refers to any act that is perpetrated against a person's will and is based on gender norms and unequal power relationships. We're going to unpack that definition a little bit later, but I like the fact that they name it's perpetrated against someone against their will based on gender norms and unequal power relationships. Another definition from the U.S. Department of State is gender-based violence is an umbrella term for any harmful threat or act directed at an individual or group based on actual or perceived biological sex, gender identity and or expression, sexual orientation, and or lack of adherence to varying socially constructed norms around masculinity and femininity. It is rooted in structural gender inequalities, patriarchy, and power imbalances. So again, this could be based on someone's actual or perceived biological sex. We know that a lot of times violence is enacted against people based on assumptions about their biological sex that may or may not be wrong. We see that especially in racialized misogynistic attacks. We also know that it can be against someone based on their gender identity or sexual orientation, their expression, largely not adhering to varying socially constructed norms around masculinity and femininity can make you a target no matter what your gender identity or sex assigned at birth is. So we put it all together and we have to realize sexual violence is gendered but not gendered. And that's kind of a silly thing to say, but I'm going to unpack what we mean by that. It's gendered as in it's based on gender, but it's not gendered as in always men against women. And I'm going to give you a content warning. There's some heavy topics for the next few slides. And as I give examples, there may also be some heavy language or a language that's not appropriate if there's children in the room or if you're in a workplace where frank conversations about how violence happens can't be had. So violence against women, let's start with this. Violence against women is about power and control. The whole point is to say you don't even have control over your own body. And so this was enacted against women due to misogyny to establish male dominance over women. but also certain kinds of male dominance over certain kinds of women. And when we look at the history of war and slavery, we see that played out. So in this regard, sexual and partner violence are, in fact, about violence against women, even though that may not be how they always manifest. And so under this root cause, this framing, this violence against women is about power and control. This framing is patriarchal and relies on a few assumptions. And we're going to move into a few reflections to unpack what this means. It assumes that there is a group of people who are considered superior and who have power. It assumes there is a group of people who are considered inferior and who should be controlled or have their agency taken away, their ability to make choices over their own bodies. And it assumes that the definitions of who has power and who should be controlled are dependent on gendered assumptions, which means that the use of romantic and sexual violence by those who have power can be used against those who should be controlled to keep them under control, right? So is it dependent on someone's gender? I'm not really sure. I don't believe that it is, because in this flawed patriarchal model, if someone wants to assert entitled power over someone else, they believe they can use sexual or partner violence to dehumanize or control someone. This starts with entitlement, the belief that you should be able to control another person's behavior and body. And this belief supports violence against people who are incarcerated, right? When they use this sexual or partner kind of violence to dehumanize or control someone of any gender, it is used in a way that is meant to dehumanize or make them seem effeminate or make them convinced that they're part of the inferior group of people, no matter who they are. And because of the role of entitlement in white supremacy, homophobia, and transphobia, this is also why we see disproportionate impacts on Black and brown women, and even higher impacts against queer and trans Black and brown women and femmes. Right? So what this means is this belief that there's a group of people who can be controlled because they're inferior by dominant people using sexual or partner violence, that model can then get enacted against anyone that you want to dehumanize or control. In this model, anyone who's perceived as feminine may be targeted for sexual or partner violence because of their gender. And this is why women are disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence, but it's also why gay and bisexual men and trans femmes are also disproportionately targeted. If we see you as having any feminine qualities or being tied to or close to feminine qualities, I think you're a mama's boy, I think you're effeminate, I don't think you're masculine enough, right? Then you are at risk of being targeted for sexual or partner violence because of your gender and the way you're not adhering to gender norms. We also know that in this model, sexual or partner violence may be used as a method of feminizing someone, or stripping someone of their perceived masculinity through gender-based violence as a means of establishing dominance. We obviously see it used to feminize someone where it is people who are assigned female at birth who are not perceived as fulfilling their feminine behaviors and traits appropriately. In the LGBTQ anti-violence community, we are all aware that there is something called corrective rape, in which people are sexually assaulted as an effort to make them straight and feminine again. And it can also be used against men to try to force them into performing a certain kind of masculinity, or in a way to dehumanize them. So masculinity in this flawed model, masculinity and power are linked, which means that if you want to take someone's power away, you use a kind of harm that's thought to feminize them, quote unquote. This is why gender-based violence is often used as a weapon of war or oppression, right? We are assaulting your women and girls because we want you to understand that you no longer control them, we do. And furthermore, we're assaulting you because we want to show that we even have dominance over you and you belong in this inferior category. This is also why masculine people and women who defy cultural norms are often targeted for gender-based violence. So as we work through this, we're seeing that gender-based violence is indeed used as a way to attack people of all genders, in a way to force them into certain kinds of norms that are stemming from this flawed and violent model in the first place. But what that means is that now that we've created this flawed patriarchal model in which inferior people can be dominated and controlled through gender-based violence enacted by the more powerful group, well, people don't want to be seen as if they're in the powerless group. If you don't want to be seen as powerless, then you can perform this kind of toxic patriarchal control over another person as a way to establish or strengthen your perceived power. So even people who wouldn't otherwise be participating in harming others will sometimes enact this behavior to avoid becoming the target themselves, to prove their toughness, to show that they are in control and have power over another person. And anyone who steps out of traditional roles in this model gets punished, right? It can take the form of harassment, can take the form of non-sexual violence, but often it includes sexual and partner violence and sexual harassment. And all of the violence that happens under this category is gender-based violence, whether it's against anyone of any gender, perpetrated by anyone of any gender. This is gender-based violence. Also, under this model, because we've assigned feminine traits to those who need to be controlled, who else needs to be controlled? In a lot of people's models, I'm not saying that I do not believe this. I can assert that I do not believe this, but a lot of people believe that children and youth need to be controlled, especially those who are really, really unable to take care of themselves, or who are really, really stepping out of line and not doing things the way that we think they should. So under this flawed model, anyone who's perceived as vulnerable or without agency may be targeted for sexual or partner violence. And this belief is why children and youth, particularly those from marginalized communities, are often harmed. It's why incarcerated people, youth and adults, as well as people with physical, intellectual, or developmental disabilities, are often targeted for harassment. And it's also why fostering what we call benevolent sexism doesn't work. And we're going to talk a little bit later about what benevolent sexism is. So we're going to break down these definitions. We're going back to those two definitions we started with, and one of them from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Sexual and gender-based violence refers to any act that is perpetrated against a person's will and is based on gender norms and unequal power relationships, right? So breaking that down, what we find is that it's gender norms that are very rigid, right? I'm not saying that any woman who likes to wear a dress or that any man who doesn't want to wear a dress is, stuck in rigid gender norms. What I'm saying is when they become really rigidified and strengthened and codified as part of how our society functions, when we have that plus unequal relationships, that's how an act can be perpetrated against someone's will, right? So it's an act against someone's will that relies on gender norms and unequal relationships. That's pretty broad, right? And under this category, it can be anyone of any gender who's enacting this act. It can be anyone of any gender who's on the receiving end, who is harmed, who is violated by gender-based violence. It's not dependent on the perpetrator of the victim or on the gender of the perpetrator or the victim. Our second definition, we're going to break it down too. So it's an umbrella term for any harmful threat or act directed at an individual or group based on all of this list of things, right? So if we break it down, we have a harmful threat or act against an individual or a group that is based on any one of these things: actual or perceived biological sex, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, or lack of adherence to norms around masculinity and femininity. This is why we see a lot of attacks and harassment of the transgender community today, right? When we think about things like making assumptions about what someone should or should not be able to do based on either their actual or perceived biological sex, we run the risk of harm. We have seen anti-trans violence enacted against Black women because racism and misogyny combine in a way that makes people make harmful assumptions about what they think their biological sex is, right? If we start making these assumptions, we're all at risk of experiencing violence. This is something we see when we see men and boys who don't fit the social norms or are trying to break out of the social norms and are punished for it. So this means when we're doing our anti-violence work, our advocacy, our organizing, our collaborations, we want to be thoughtful about our gendered language. So some reasons to be thoughtful about how you use gendered language. The NSVRC reports, which is the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, they report that 27.2% of women and 11.7% of men have experienced unwanted sexual contact. The majority of sexual violence, even against men, was perpetrated by men, but some was in fact perpetrated by women or non-binary people. We want to be able to talk honestly about harmful cultural expectations about masculinity while also leaving room for them to understand and identify sexual harm they might have experienced. If the only way you're engaging men is as bystanders and telling them to get engaged as bystanders when they see men enacting harm against women, they're going to miss out on being able to see their own experiences of harm and violence. Male survivors of sex trafficking or survivors of any gender who have female traffickers underreport and are underrepresented. We know that there is a lack of identification of, a lack of services, a lack of reporting to anyone, not just to law enforcement, but to anyone by male survivors of sex trafficking. Or anyone who has a female trafficker, because we know that when we present a model that doesn't fit someone's experience, they're not going to see themselves in the description we give of what trafficking is, which means they're going to be less likely to recognize harm they're experiencing, to reach out and seek out help when they need it. We want to be able to reach more people. It's important for us to use language. It's not just about being politically correct or woke when we use language that is inclusive. It's about making sure that we show that we care about all survivors of trafficking and that we want them all to be able to get the services and support they need. We want to be careful about our language because anyone of any gender is capable of causing sexual or partner harm. We all need to be thoughtful, no matter what your gender is, any power you have, you need to be thoughtful about how you wield power. And anytime you're trying to get your needs met, we need to be thoughtful of how we try to get those needs met. And when we talk about bystander intervention, we want people to know that harmful behavior from women is still inappropriate. It doesn't matter who's perpetrating the harm. If you witness it, you have a responsibility to engage as a good community member, right? Anyone of any gender is capable of causing sexual or partner harm. I was once in a room where someone was giving a training and said, "What does a trafficker look like? Anyone? Anyone?" And then they said, "Actually, a trafficker can look like me or any other man in this room." And all I could think was how the hearts of every person in that room who is either a male victim or male survivor of trafficking or whose perpetrator was not a man, how their heart must have sunk as they realized, is this place for me? This place may not be for me. This place may not see me. Remember that LGBTQ people exist, including trans people, and they are in your audiences, whether you know they are or not. And that includes among your attendees at trainings, students that you work with, colleagues who you work with, clients. These people are in your communities, whether you know it or not. Queer people in the spaces that you're in, they may not be out. In fact, they may be trying very hard to stay closeted because they're afraid of being targeted. And this is true in rural and urban settings. So don't make assumptions. If you give examples in your teaching or your education or your awareness, that use entirely heterosexual assumptions, a lot of people in your audience are going to find that less relevant. You could have trans people in your spaces and you would not even know it. They may be closeted and living their life as their birth gender to avoid harm. They're still transgender, no matter how they're presenting in that moment. Or maybe they've already come out and you might not even know that they're trans. You might be perceiving them as the gender that they're presenting as, not knowing that they're trans, and then inadvertently say things that can cause them harm. Trans people often have incredible insight on expectations to perform gender in a specific way. And they might have a lot to contribute to discussions about gender norms, to your frameworks, to how you do your work, if they feel welcome being part of your work. And again, remember that non-binary people may be in your spaces and you might not even know it. Some non-binary people still use binary pronouns such as he, him, or she, her. Often non-binary people might just not share their pronouns at all, even if they prefer something else, because it's easier to be misgendered unintentionally by people you've never told than to be continually misgendered by people you've asked to use your right pronouns. We want to avoid benevolent sexism, right? We do know the majority of sexual violence, even against men, was perpetrated by men, although some was perpetrated by women or non-binary people. Hostile sexism is about derogatory beliefs about women. I think women are trash, women are liars, women are sluts. Like, this is all hostile sexism. Those are examples of hostile sexism. Benevolent sexism is seemingly positive beliefs about women that might include things about them being innocent, virtuous, worthy of protecting. Women are innocent. They don't want to go out and be sluts. They want to be pure, so we must protect their purity. Women are virtuous. They're worth being protected, right? We shouldn't just let violence happen against them because they're virtuous and worthy of being protected. So some bystander intervention approaches have tried to leverage benevolent sexism to motivate bystander intervention as a prevention tactic for gender-based violence, by saying things like girls and women are innocent when they experience sexual violence. But there's a recent study that shows that benevolent sexism is associated with less intervention in post-assault situations, greater barriers in pre-assault intervention, and greater failure to perceive responsibility and skill deficit across all situations. What that means is that if we see someone using a bystander method that says people like women are virtuous, we should protect women and girls, what we find is that they're less likely before an assault has happened to intervene while they're seeing things escalate, because they have assumptions that if this person doesn't look like innocent, virtuous, pure, that maybe certain women don't deserve to be protected, right? We also find less intervention in post-assault situations among those, because if they have beliefs that women are virtuous and innocent and worthy of being protected, a lot of times it can backfire when the survivors don't seem innocent or virtuous or protectable enough, when people are not encouraged to check their power. Related, we know the CDC has identified through public health research that rigid adherence to harmful gender norms is a risk factor for sexual violence. And we can't shoehorn that and shape it to try to make it a strategy if we're still promoting rigid adherence to harmful gender norms as part of our prevention strategy. We want men to be able to talk honestly about harmful cultural expectations about masculinity, while also leaving room for them to understand and identify sexual harm they might have experienced. Now, does this mean, if we're avoiding this benevolent sexism where women are virtuous and innocent and deserve to be protected, does this mean that we're like, women don't deserve any of that, they're horrible? No, what it means is that we can have a framework where we say all people, no matter how virtuous or innocent appearing they are, don't deserve assault. We stand in solidarity with all people. We don't want to protect and rescue people. We want to be in solidarity with them. We want to intervene when we see situations escalating, right? That we can still work on our prevention without shoehorning it into a benevolent sexism strategy. So some action steps that you might want to consider taking as a result of the concepts we've discussed in this training. Just remember, anytime we talk about gender and gender-based violence, not all women are victims, not all men are harm doers, and anyone of any gender can be a victim. Anyone of any gender can be a harm doer. Gender-based violence is not only perpetrated by men against women. It's just not. That's just not true. Assume that you have trans and queer people in the room at all times. Whether you know there are or not, even if you think there are not, how would it change what you say and how you frame violence if you assumed that there always were people who are transgender or otherwise lesbian, gay, or bisexual in the room when you're engaging, when you're doing awareness campaigns? Assume that trans and queer people will see that awareness campaign. Does it reach them if they are experiencing violence? Does it demonize them? Right? I think we have to ask that in the year 2023. We know that queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people have unique insights into how gender dynamics impact experiences of violence. So see that as insight and as wisdom and as deeper understanding than some other people may have. We also know people with other marginalized identities, to include Black, Indigenous, Latine, otherwise migrant, Asian, disabled, neurodivergent, undocumented migrants. All of these people have unique insights into how gender intersects with other forms of marginalization. And we call that intersectionality, which is a phrase that Kimberly Crenshaw coined to describe the way that it's not that we just add them up and come up with a who checks the most boxes and they're the most marginalized. It's that we recognize that, for example, a neurodivergent woman may be perceived differently than a neurodivergent man. A disabled Black woman may be perceived differently from a disabled white woman. We recognize that these things interact with the way that marginalization is enacted and experienced. Remember also that many people with these identities are also queer, trans, or gender nonconforming. You can't ask people when you're creating awareness campaigns or educating or developing a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. You can't ask people to pick which identity they want to relate to the most in any given moment, because we're all whole people at all times. And then be really careful to avoid invoking benevolent sexism in your work, either by portrayals of women and feminine folks as pure, innocent, vulnerable, and in need of protection, or by portrayals of men and masculine folks as needing to protect the more vulnerable, because that's not disrupting power dynamics, that's reinforcing them. We can still encourage bystander intervention with frameworks that assume those bystanders are equals. We can still encourage bystander intervention where we show up with each other in solidarity. That's the approach we want to take at the National Survivor Network. Thank you so much for your time.